This is episode 81 of the HooperCast. This is crazy to me. Hello, Dustin.
Hello, Hooper.
We're in the 80s.
We're getting to be experts now.
Speaking of the 80s, I was watching Back to the Future 3 earlier. That's a good movie, man.
Dude, that's a great movie. Everyone's like, that's the worst movie
the worst
of the bunch.
One. Yeah, no,
and I don't know.
I like it.
Maybe it is, but that's like saying, hey, you see these super delicious oranges? That one over there is a little less delicious, but it's still super delicious.
Well, I just feel like it ties everything up really well.
It does.
When you think about how full circle it brings the whole story, there's one part that's brilliant. Like when they're talking about the gravestone, and it's like, the gravestone still has the same, date on it and everything. The gravestone still exists, so maybe it's your name that's going to be on that. And then Marty finally walks away and he's like, oh, great, Scott. And then Doc says, I know, this is heavy.
And it's like, yeah.
That moment right there just sort of sums up the continuation of that joke. And then finally it's to a close, but in a different, I don't know. It's just.
No, you're absolutely right. Like, it's a super smart way to sort of show off the direction that their friendship has gone.
Yeah.
And what I love about it, too, is it gives Doc a little more to do in the third one.
Yeah.
Because he's in his element. This is, the time period that he loves. And he gets to fall in love. And it just lets him stretch his wings and not just be like that guy who's, just basically the inciting incident.
And it sort of reinforces the universal truth that women will make you change your opinion on almost everything.
Yep. That's about right.
Even in the space-time continuum.
I know, right?
Before that woman Clara shows up, he's all like, we can't mess with anything. And then she's all like,
there.
But Emmett, I love you. And he's like, you know what? I think the future could be written. You could live your future. That's good.
Let's just do whatever we want to do.
Right,
Yeah.
Nah, it's a great movie. I'm enjoying it. I mean, I have them all. I keep a movie on my phone at all times. It's a boredom safeguard. So anytime I feel like I'm gonna be tied up for a few minutes and I don't have anything to do, I just sit there and watch Back to the Future. So I'm almost finished with that one right now. It's great, even on my phone. Great movie.
I know, right? It's so good.
Anyway, well, Dustin and I saw a couple movies, and then we wanted to talk about some film news this week. Dustin, I want to go first.
Okay.
Because I didn't write any of my thoughts down for this movie. I just kind of want to
just wing it.
Get my thoughts out on it before they all disappear. So I saw a documentary on Netflix, and it is a Netflix documentary. It's called My Own Man, and it's made by a guy named David Sampliner. So he's the subject of the documentary. He's about 40. He's in his 40s, and he's this, Jewish beta male. He's very sensitive. He identifies more with women in terms of like his social interaction than with other men. He has male friends. All his male friends are guys. If you're at the office, he's not over by the dudes talking about fishing. He's over in the break room with the girls, regaling him about his weekend. I don't want to make fun of the guy because there's nothing wrong with him.
Sure.
But he admittedly does not feel like a man. He realizes that he's not the stereotypical alpha male, and he's sort of insecure about it. And so his wife is pregnant, and they find out it's a boy. And so this sort of causes him to explore this deeper because he's wondering, how do you teach a young boy about being a man when you don't feel like a man? And it sort of gets into this stuff with his dad, who is a man's man, and he has issues. You sort of learn progressively that he kind of has some issues with his dad, and so overall, the documentary is. I kind of expect to be wowed by it a little more. Here's the great thing about documentary: even if it's not that good, you still learn something.
Yeah,
it wasn't the best one I'd ever seen. You still watch a guy confront some issues with his own father and dealing with fatherhood himself. And there's some, there's like some strange group therapy I've never seen in this movie, where like, they're like, okay, like talk about, kind of imitate the feeling of your dad, like coming home and, you know, whatever. And so he sort of just like screams like a curse word, you know, and so there's like, okay. And so they stop him and it's like, okay, now hold on to that. And I'm like, oh God, I would rip this place apart. I'd be so angry at this dude for telling me to cut me off midstream while I'm trying to.
I know, right?
But so they have another dude come in and be like, okay, now this guy's going to represent that, and I want you to stand on the receiving end of it, and I want you to say to him, you know what? So the other dude like role plays as his dad, just repeating what he just said. So it's kind of weird in that, like, it's a little uncomfortable because I'd be like, God, I could never open up like this to a bunch of to like a man's group. It's like a men's therapy thing. So it's like this weird like therapy fight club thing. It's interesting. I guess with the amount I just talked about it, it's probably worth seeing. It's on Netflix, you know, and I like the guy. I mean, he tries to do some stereotypical man things. Like he goes hunting, he shoots a deer, and he has a pretty good shot. Like,
really? Wow.
Yeah, he like nails him like right in the heart. Like he never shot, but you know, it was pretty cool. But then he feels all guilty about it and stuff. So
sure.
So I think if you're if you're the same kind of guy he is, or even if you are kind of like an alpha male, I don't know, it's sort of interesting maybe to explore a guy who isn't that way, but admittedly he's wondering if he should be okay with the amount of manhood he displays. So
sure.
I didn't mean to go on that long about that movie. But yeah, it's called My Own Man, and it's on Netflix, and I assume it will be for a while because they own it. So
that sounds like, to me, that sounds like an interesting topic, just because I don't know how to really phrase this.
These days, more and more men are like that.
Yeah. The fact is, whereas in the past there may have been, you know, a type of man, now everything has been expanded, right? You can be a man and still, you know, I don't hunt or whatever, but I'm into, you know, cars.
Right.
But I can be into cars, but also still be into, like, you know, I don't know, decoration. You know, it's weird that people can latch on to a lot of different things, and I think part of that, just in my thought process, is that it's because we're exposed to so much more. Yeah. So people have more opportunity now than maybe a man from like the 1930s would have had, you know, which is sort of that era where you're thinking of, you know, men, you know, fighting and be like, hey, you, hey, kid.
Well, yeah, and much more jobs. Like that's back when we had, when much more of the workforce was trades or manual labor, where you worked with your hands. You worked on an assembly line, or you built things, or you welded things. You built ships, or you built, you know, boats. You just built stuff, or you farmed. And just today, there's a lot more dudes who just sit in offices and, you know, go to copy machines all day and use microwaves and, you know, don't even cook their own food, or, you know, and so I think the documentary is a little bit scattered in that. I guess maybe it's scattered, or maybe it's just broad, because they're trying to tackle the idea of his issues with his dad and fatherhood, but also manhood in general. So every now and then he'll sit down with a friend of his. And one particular part, I think the part of the movie I most identified with was the guy's like, I see manhood as is not really caring what other people think of you. You know, it's doing what's right and doing what you have to do, and not caring at all if other people approve, not needing other people's approval when you know what you're doing is right. And that's pretty much right. I mean, anyone could say, well, I think manhood is knitting a blanket or blah, blah, blah. And it's like, I guess to you it is, but I feel like to a lot of people, like the definition of manhood has become broader without, you know, undermining its meaning or its significance, you know, but it's like you said, you know, we're exposed to much more now. I mean, I just got done watching Mad Men, and that's sort of, it ends in 1970, and that's like the dawn of men going to therapy. Because back before that was for like your wife, you know. Right. That was for the woman. You know, men didn't talk about their feelings to each other, much less to a therapist. And then men started going to therapy, and so you could argue whether or not that's actually helped mental health or not, because, you know, then it gives people these hypochondriac mental problems like, oh, I'm insecure, but whereas in the Great Depression, the insecure guy would have just said, well, I still have to go to work, you know. Right. So I feel like I just got lost, but I guess what I'm saying is it should appeal to men. I guess women too, but man is in the title. This is really this is really for men, and more people could identify with this guy than, if this had come out 20 years ago.
Sure. Right. I feel like if it had come out 20 years ago, it would have been more like a comedy piece almost, or
right.
like
let's
look
just
at
make
me. Fun of him.
I'm neurotic.
Mm-hmm. Like, well, I mean, you think about somebody like Woody Allen, who sort of made his living on that kind of mentality.
Yeah.
The thought process of just being scattered and neurotic and nervous all the time. And at that time, that was funny, and now that's much more commonplace. So I don't know that has the same punch that it used to.
I mean, do you feel personally, like, do you like, for me, I don't consider myself devoid of manhood. Like, I'm not so self-absorbed as to say, like, I'm a guy's guy. Sure. I mean, I feel like a man just because I do what I have to do. I work hard. I really don't care what other people think of me unless they employ me. Or they're married to me, or they're my children, but, I mean, I feel like, I felt like let's see, when I bought this house, I felt like a man, because I was like, this is what men do. You start a family, you buy a house, you go. So there's a little bit of the stereotype in there of what a man is. So I still strive for this John Wayne, Humphrey Bogart, like,
sure.
Like this man's man thing, without feeling like I'm nothing without that ideal. So do you kind of feel like that too? I feel like it's sort of a little nugget that's in every young boy.
I feel like there are basically like three qualities that make a man, and those three qualities are responsibility, providing for those who rely on you. Also, what makes a man is, like you said, just not caring, doing what makes you
resolute.
Right. It's fortitude. That's one of my favorite words, because it's just like, this is me. I'm strong in this. I'm, passionate about it, and I don't really care if you agree with me or if you don't.
Right.
So there's that, and then the other thing that I think makes a man is a willingness to lead, and I guess this goes along with responsibility, but a willingness to lead others to growth. And I think maybe that applies maybe more to father, but I think that it still applies to man, because I believe that man should seek to do that for his wife. A man should seek to do that for his friends, to lead them to be better than they were yesterday. And so I think those three things make a man, and I think that none of those things are outdated or like they're not material. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like I don't consider a man like, oh, well, he's a man because he hunts, or he's a man because he can build, birdhouses in like 5 seconds. I'm talking about like, this is a man because he does these sort of intangible things.
Yeah.
And you're right that even 20 years ago, that thought process wouldn't have been there. That thought process wouldn't have ever been sort of imagined.
What happened was that same thing was true back in the day, and it was also socially accepted because men were kind of, men had the upper hand socially. And then it was battled against with, the rise of females. There's in every aspect of life, in the workplace and just in general.
Right.
And so now it's like, it's not really popular to say those kind of things, but it doesn't make it any less true,
Sure.
and people don't like to say it because then it implies that men and women are, inherently different in certain ways,
roles,
or that there is, but I have a daughter, and I'm not going to raise my daughter to be one way or the other. I can just tell you how she is, and
Right.
she's very rough and tumble, like certain people may not expect a girl to be. But there are distinct feminine qualities to her, and I didn't put those on her. My wife didn't put those on her. That's just how she is.
She's still too young to even have that put upon her.
Right. Like, we didn't put her in pink dresses and say, this is what you're going to wear. This is what you're going to like. We put her in little dresses sometimes, but most of the time she's just in onesies and, pants and stuff. I didn't teach her to enjoy wrestling. She just does it.
Yeah.
And instigates it on me. She likes pink enough to where when she sees it, she's like, like she's partial to it. But we didn't do that.
Right.
I guess this all ties into the documentary in that, I mean, obviously there's many, many layers to this, this subject, and sadly they're not all covered in this film. But this is certainly a conversation starter, as you can see, as to the nature.
We got a little more psychological in this episode.
Oh, hell yeah. And speaking of therapy,
and, I know,
there's a lot more to this subject than just one man's story of dealing with his own manhood and his issues with his own father. And like I said, with the inherent thing, they even talk about in the movie how, the dad was like this, kind of like he lifted weights a lot, and like, so his first son kind of did that. But when David came out, he was just this happy kid who liked to kind of prance around, and he was just happy. But he liked to play sports too, but he just wasn't as into it. It just didn't define him,
Mm-hmm.
And there's, nothing wrong with that. It's just sort of a different thing,
Yeah.
Anyway, okay, I'm sorry, Dustin. Been talking
That's cool.
So long. I started talking about Back to the Future, and then this documentary. I'm taking up all the time.
So I saw Selma, which is not a new movie, and to be fair, probably a lot of our demographic here has probably seen this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I finally saw Selma. I did not see it in theaters, and that's just because I didn't find the time. It's not. I always had an interest and always intended on seeing it. I just never did find the time. So anyway, it finally showed up on Redbox, so I checked it out. And it's a really good movie. When it comes right down to it, it doesn't really do anything that you don't expect it to do. Basically, for those of you who don't know, it chronicles Martin Luther King Jr.'s time in Selma. The civil rights movement was taking off at this time, and he plans a march from Selma to Montgomery, and it's a lot about the opposition that he faces, both politically and just socially, to the march and to what it is he's trying to do. This kind of goes back to what we were talking about, Hooper, with being a man. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was resolute in what he intended to do, and
he's a great example of manhood.
He really is. I mean,
among other things, obviously.
Sure. He definitely made an effort to grow his fellow man and make them better day by day, as well as the country itself. So Martin Luther King Jr. certainly, this is an important film, and it allows him a chance to kind of shine. But at the same time, I felt like this movie was a little more about the politics of what was happening rather than, say, his life or what he personally was going through. You'll see a little bit of him, sitting in prison, and a little bit of his personal relationship with his wife, but it doesn't have a lot to do with him or with his, personal, what was happening with him personally at that time. Instead, it's, here's the goal, and then here's an obstacle thrown at him, whether that's by LBJ, played by Tom Wilkinson, or, Tim Roth plays Governor George Wallace.
Yeah, we know about George Wallace over here.
Yes, I knew you'd recognize the name. To me, the film seems a little scattered in that we get to spend this time with these characters that are trying to make a difference. And instead of seeing everything through their eyes, we cut to Washington, or we cut to, George Wallace having a conversation in his chambers with, whoever it may be. And these are things that I suppose happened, but that Martin Luther King Jr. was not a part of. I guess I just relate more to stories that are told through a specific point of view. And this wasn't necessarily just everything that Martin Luther King Jr. was going through. It was almost like you are a fly on the wall during the events, and sometimes you're looking at things that Martin Luther King Jr. is doing, and sometimes you're not. To me, that makes the film a little less personal and a little less emotional to jump around like that, because you don't have a center. It's like, I hate to use this analogy, but like Harry Potter, right? So in Harry Potter, pretty much everything that you ever see in those films, you see through the eyes of Harry. So it centers it for you. There's only a few times that I can think of in those films where we're seeing something that Harry himself either didn't live through or know about. So it gives the audience a clear center and a clear character that they are supposed to essentially be during this chunk of time. Selma doesn't really have that. Martin Luther King Jr. is not necessarily that in this film, although he's a huge character in the film, and he certainly has the most screen time. The point still stands that by seeing things that he was not a part of, we're almost privy to information that he isn't, which then makes us in a different boat than Martin Luther King. So then, it's hard to have that grounding. That would be my only real complaint about the movie. Other than that, it's a good movie. It's shot well. The cinematography, you know what? I will say this about the cinematography too, and this is a little bit of a complaint. It's pretty plain. There's not much to it. It looks fine, but it's not like, oh man, that's brilliant. And there's a couple of times where I felt like the framing was really weird. The composition was just strange, and I'm not sure why the director chose to shoot it in these ways. And if you see the film, you'll probably recognize them. There's, for instance, a point where Martin Luther King is, I believe, doing a funeral, and the way they framed him, he's in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen with all this negative space around him, but it's not like the rule of thirds where you can kind of see like maybe, his head, his neck, his shoulders, and a little bit, below that, like maybe down to like, like his breast or something. You're not seeing that much. They've shoved him down into the corner, so kind of all you're seeing is his head. And it's really weird framing because everything else is just a wall. And so I wonder why they shot in certain things in certain ways like that. But anyway, other than that, it's a good movie and it's an important story, and it's certainly not boring. It's an important part of American history, and I think it's an enjoyable watch, even if it isn't fun. If you haven't seen Selma, it's not super important that you go out and watch it right now. But if you find yourself with a free evening and you just want to settle in with something, this isn't a bad choice, and you're not going to like get up and go, man, that was a waste of my time or a waste of my $1.50 or whatever. There's no rush on it.
We've got a news story to talk about this week, too.
Yes, we do.
This is about Tron 3, which was in production or was going to happen, and then all of a sudden it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And then there's like a petition to make it happen, right?
Yes. Long story short, Disney's been on the fence since Tron Legacy, and they've not pulled the trigger on another Tron film, just because probably of like budgetary reasons. Because I know Tron costs a lot of money to make. Yeah. It's a lot of vis effects and stuff. But I thought Tron Legacy did pretty well. Considering, but I'm looking at it on Box Office Mojo right now, and it looks like the production budget for Tron Legacy was $170 million, and the total domestic gross was $172 million. Oh, so wow. It really only made $2 million.
And that's not even considered a profit, like in...
Right. Now, the foreign gross, though, was another $228 million for a grand total of $400 million. Typically, they say if you double the production budget, then you're good. You're good for a sequel. This, when you total in domestic and foreign, did, in fact, more than double the budget. So the thought process was that this deserved a sequel, and there was certainly some sort of fan movement for that to happen. And all those involved, Jeff Bridges, Garrett Hedlund, Olivia Wilde, and the director, Joseph Kosinski, all were on board for another film should Disney greenlight it. It seemed like it was going to happen, and then it didn't, and then they made like a short film, and then it didn't happen, and then you thought like, there was a lot of back and forth, but it seems like a few months ago they announced that Tron 3 was likely to happen. It would start shooting this fall, I believe, fall of 2015. Undoubtedly, Joseph Kosinski has been working on, previs and, all these, key, aesthetic decisions for months. But to be fair, Disney has never officially greenlit the sequel. They never made an announcement that, yes, we're doing it. It was always just kind of like, maybe. We'll maybe do this. And so now they've officially pulled the plug on it, and it's a little confusing as to why, because there's obviously some sort of a demand for it, and it did more than double its budget when you count in foreign totals. To me, it's a little surprising that there's not going to be another. What about you, Hooper?
I don't know. I mean, when did the last one come out? Wasn't it like 2009 or something? 2010?
Yeah, it was 2010.
Yeah. So it's been 5 years. Wow.
Yeah. But think about how long it was between Tron and Tron Legacy.
Well, yeah. I mean, Tron Legacy was one of those movies that was made because of brand recognition, albeit, who knew about Tron, really? And they happened to pull it off. Like, it was popular, but clearly not popular enough to make that much money, more than their budget. I can live without them making another Tron. I never felt... I don't really understand the outrage about it. Yeah. Like, no, like there must be a Tron. It's like, really? Like, you're gonna pick this battle?
Right. Yeah, I would love to see a sequel, but I'm not going to get upset about it.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't feel like there needs to be one. I mean, spoiler alert for Tron Legacy: the movie ends by Sam getting out of the computer, and his father's dead, and he got Cora out, so now he's got this, hot computer android or whatever she is, and they literally ride off into the sunset on a motorcycle.
It's true.
So you can't get much more closure than that for a story. So it's not like there's this giant cliffhanger that we'll never see the resolution to. I'm fine with that, but yeah, I mean, if it seems to make sense that they wouldn't do another one. In my opinion.
Yeah, I think the thought process on Disney's side is probably budgetary, but also the fact that they've got so much money that they're throwing around right now between Star Wars and Marvel that pretty much have guaranteed returns, that to add another $170 million to their outgoing expenditures, it's hard to justify that when they're already spending as much as they are. Now, if they were in the same place they were in 2010, where they didn't have this big Marvel tank and Star Wars now,
they'd be depending on Tron.
Right, they'd be a little more probably, let's see if we can make this a franchise. Whereas now it's just kind of like, if it's a franchise, great, but we're already making a lot of money.
Yeah.
It's the equivalent of like me being like, okay, I've gone out to eat a lot this week, so I'm spending a lot of money. Should I go out to eat again, or should I just try to make something at home? Well, I'm just going to try to make something at home because I've gone out a lot. So it's sort of like that to me. Like, Disney is saying, we're putting out a lot of money. Why would we put out more? You see what I'm saying? I don't know. That's not a great analogy.
Well, it's essentially like, it's kind of like attractive women. I mean, there's a woman who you would go out with. I don't know this personally from experience. I didn't have a bunch of women lining up to date me. But if I had, that's like if one of them came up and was like, hey, I think you're cute. Like, and I'm like, yeah, we should go on a date. But if I got, 4 other women who are much more attractive and much, nicer and much more, attuned to my interests, who are all vying for my attention. Again, this has never happened to me before. And that 5th one was like, hey, so how about that date? I'd be like, yeah, you see, there's these 4 others that I've already kind of committed to. Otherwise, I'd totally go with you, but not worth the risk. Exactly. I don't know. That's still not a great analogy, but
no, but it gets the job done. I mean, look, the thing is, to be fair too, Disney has thrown a lot of money at live action projects recently, and it hasn't worked out. Here's looking at you, Lone Ranger. I can understand their hesitation to throw another $200 million at something that's not guaranteed, especially something that's a science fiction and kind of a niche kind of a thing. The Lone Ranger's budget, this is going to blow your mind, Hooper. The Lone Ranger remember what I said Tron Legacy's production budget was?
I remember the Lone
$170 million.
Ranger was significantly, wasn't it like a record-breaking amount of money for that?
$215 million to make the Lone Ranger. And do you know what it made on its total domestic
Did it
gross?
make about half that?
$89 million.
Oh my God.
On a $215 million budget. Wow. Now I understand Disney's hesitation.
Yeah.
To do anything ever again.
I mean, it's a business. It has to survive. And for them, it's like, this isn't worth the risk. Like, it's been too long since the last movie. We're safe with these other franchises. They're not guaranteed moneymakers, but they're popular and do well with the franchises we've already established, other than trying to build a new one right now. Yeah, I get it.
And true, too, they may have been sort of monitoring the performance of Tomorrowland, which came out a few weeks ago. So it makes sense now that the announcement kind of comes after this. Right. Tomorrowland was also a disappointment in that the production budget is $190 million. It's only been out for a couple of weeks, so it's hard to kind of say, as of May 31st anyway, the total domestic gross was $63 million. And that's probably the bulk of what it was going to make. Unless it makes a lot in home video, or unless there's a peak somewhere because there's just nothing else out, I don't see it making a lot of money. But the problem that it faces too is in 2 weeks Jurassic World opens and everyone will forget about Tomorrowland.
It'll be Yesterdayland.
It'll be Yesterdayland. So it makes sense too that Disney might look at that and say, okay, opening weekend, Tomorrowland makes $33 million. And let me look at, the opening weekend for the Lone Ranger was $29 million. So they're not very far apart. It makes sense that they would be hesitant to do another Tron. It sucks because I do like that universe, and I think that if they built it with a little more care, they could have something really, really cool. But the problem with Tron Legacy, and while I enjoy the film, I would say this is, maybe my biggest concern. The grid isn't really a very, I don't know what the grid can do. You know what I mean? Like, I don't have a good idea of what it is and what it is capable of and what it is incapable of. And the types of programs that live there, I'm not 100% sure what all their capabilities are. So the world building is a little lackluster, and so I would hope with the Tron 3 they would be able to answer some of these questions and more adequately build the world of Tron. So maybe it's a good thing that we're not getting another, because if they failed at that a third time, it would probably be a disappointment.
Well, the mistake has already happened with that. Yeah. Like with Tron Legacy is a fine film, but in terms of building a franchise, the groundwork should have been laid in that film. What that film is a direct sequel to Tron, and nothing more. It's like, hey, that's where Kevin Flynn is, and there's his son. We go in, we get him, and there's my dad. That's it. And even then, like, there was nothing in Tron that was a cliffhanger to Tron Legacy, except the world of the grid, But now that Kevin Flynn, I mean, you could bring Kevin Flynn back. He sort of computer died. But there's a recycle bin, and all computers and data recovery and stuff. So just get some nerd in there, give him $50. You could find your dad.
Yeah, exactly.
If they had set up any other characters in that movie that would want to kill Sam Flynn or blah 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 or global domination or something, they could have done it. Besides Clue, they could have done that, and at least then you would have had setup and potential storylines that were a seed planted in the viewer's mind. But what happened was, 5 years went by with no more Tron stuff and no hint of the next adventure for them in or out of the grid. You'd have to do it in the grid. It's not really interesting outside the grid. So why would he go back into the grid? He has no reason to go back now. So there's no believable reason to me that he would return to the grid at all, or even really any other characters within the grid would have stories. Because again, Tron, a bunch of characters existed in the grid and just lived there. It wasn't until Kevin Flynn showed up. Like, you can't have Garrett Hedlund's brother go into the grid and experience it for the first time. So there are no ties to future stories that they laid out. So they would have to establish all of that in the third movie of this franchise that takes place 5 years after the second movie in the franchise. And then you have to lay a bunch of groundwork in this one before you even hook people into a franchise.
It's true. And
so the groundwork should have been laid in the last movie, and they missed the boat on that. And now, to me, it's like the second Star Trek movie. But at least Star Trek has the same characters and other stories. But it's like too much time has passed. That alone is a concern. But also, all these story elements are not even there. You have to do all that work in the next movie, and that's tough.
Right. And I think they tried. I think the Cillian Murphy character was the seed to something else.
That's true. I forgot about that.
But he had a cameo. I don't even think he was listed in the credits. It was like a half of a tease, you know?
Yeah.
It was a half of a setup. And sure, in the third one they could have gone back and shown him, and then, you know, great. But it wasn't enough to like leave me at the end of Legacy saying, "Oh, I wonder what that guy's up to." And there, you know, it's not like there's an after credits sequence where you see him like, you know, mucking around on a computer. Yeah, you're right. They would have to build the world again. And even worse, because from what I understand, the movie was tentatively called Tron Ascension and had to do with the people or the programs from the grid ascending essentially into our world. So I think I heard somebody say that's a hard pitch when essentially it's just the Adam Sandler movie Pixels that's coming out. It's essentially the same thing.
Right.
And then my problem with that too is, well, if we're not going to be on the grid, then again, I don't understand the grid. I still am lost as to, you know, what it actually is. I understand that, you know, the first Tron was made at a time where maybe the screenwriters weren't super familiar with computers.
Yeah.
But now we know so much about computers, we ought to be able to come up with something believable and kind of cool. And while aesthetically Tron is that, it's lacking in the world building, you know, area.
Very much so.
Yeah, it really is. And they add in these things like, okay, well, Cora is this ISO. She's the last ISO. But they don't really tell us what the ISO is or what she can and cannot do. If she comes to our world, can she still do things, or is she something else? It's all very murky in terms of, you know, the way that world works. And that's really my only major concern with Tron Legacy. I mean, I think it's a good movie, and it's certainly fun to watch. And it has a good through line, I think, that essentially Jeff Bridges is fighting a younger version of himself, you know, a dictator version of himself, while his son tries to, you know, get to know him at the same time. You know, I don't know. I think there was a lot of potential in Tron Legacy that I see, and maybe I look over some of the flaws of the film just because I think it's such a great concept.
Yeah.
And everybody's having such a good time. So, you know,
it's just that the world has such a small shelf life when they don't add to it. Like, they really didn't add anything to the world for that movie. And to me, if you're going to do two movies where nothing about the setting itself has really changed, and then you tie up a bunch of character storylines in that movie, then doing a third one is really tough.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like if we talked about Back to the Future at the beginning of this episode. It's kind of like it's kind of like they did the first two Back to the Futures, and then they were like, forget the storylines that 2 directly ties into 3 and all that. But let's just say with Back to the Future, let's say instead of the setup for the third one, they had tied up everyone's storyline and Doc Brown was dead and the DeLorean was destroyed and nothing about time travel had changed. And then 5 years later, it's like, let's do another one. It's like, why? Like, what is there to say? Like, it was over, you know?
Right. Part of me is sad that there's not going to be another, just because I'd love to see a really good Tron movie. But at the same time, if what we were going to get wasn't really good, and if the people at its own home studio didn't believe in it, then maybe I don't need to see it.
Yeah.
I guess that's where I'm at with it. And I will always listen to the Daft Punk score for that film and love it. Yeah. And anytime I buy a new television or a new sound system, I will probably pop that film in.
Yeah.
And give it a test run.
That was one of the first things I watched when I bought my TV was Tron
Legacy.
Me too,
that was the first thing. I popped it in and I was like, this is amazing.
That's going to be the episode this week, you guys. So thanks for listening. I don't know where you're listening to us right now, but you can subscribe to us on iTunes or follow us on Podbean, hoopercastpod.podbean.com, or on Tumblr, hoopercastpod.tumblr.com, or Blogger, hoopercastpod.blogspot.com. On Tumblr and Blogger, you can click a PayPal link to donate to us if you are so inclined. If not, you can still follow the show on YouTube, HooperCastPod on YouTube, and or on Twitter at HooperCast. And you can send email questions to us at hoopercast@gmail.com, or on the Facebook page, facebook.com/HooperCast. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you guys next week.
Yeah.
Woo.
Burp.